The harbour stank of fish left too long in the sun, but the boy standing at the water's edge barely noticed any more, because he had been smelling nothing but salt and hope for 3 straight weeks. You know the name. You have heard it whispered in the same breath as tragedy and innocence, the Children's Crusade. And you probably picture a painting, soft-faced little ones in white robes, singing hymns as they march toward the sea, waiting for the waters to part like they did for Moses. That is the story they sold you. It is also, almost entirely, a lie. The real crusade of the year 1212 had no popes, no banners blessed by Rome, no knights in gleaming chainmail leading the charge. The Pope never called for it. In fact, no one did. And that is the first crack in the pretty picture. Because when you dig into what actually happened, you find that this crusade was a grassfire of desperation that swept through the Rhineland and the fields of France, and it burned through thousands of lives before anyone in power thought to stop it. So if you have ever sat in a history class and wondered why the textbooks give you the gentle version, the cherubs, the innocents, the tragedy, while the chronicles of the time hint at something far darker, you are about to get the real story. This is the tale of how faith becomes a weapon, how hope becomes a cargo, and how a movement that started with the purest intentions imaginable ended in slave markets and silence. Because here is the thing they will never put in the stained glass windows. The children were real, but the children were not the only ones marching, and they were certainly not the ones in control. You are about to learn why the word crusade should sometimes make you very, very afraid. The year was 1212, and Europe was a pressure cooker with no valve. The great age of the Crusades had already soured. Jerusalem had been lost and regained, and lost again, and every failed expedition had left behind a bitter taste of betrayal and bankruptcy. Knights had sold their lands to fund wars that accomplished nothing. Peasants had watched their lords march east and return with nothing but scars and excuses. Into this atmosphere of shattered promises came a new kind of fervor. Not from the thrones, not from the cathedrals, but from the bottom, from the fields and the villages where ordinary people had been told for generations that the Holy Land was bleeding and needed them. The chroniclers of the age used a word for these would-be pilgrims: pueri. The Latin term could mean children, yes, but it could also mean young people, boys, servants, even the poor of any age. And that ambiguity is the first thread you pull when you want to unravel the whole legend. Because the modern myth says a crowd of innocent children simply decided one day to walk to Jerusalem. The record says something wilder. A popular religious surge, a movement with no noble sponsor, no papal bull, no feudal army behind it, that somehow convinced thousands of ordinary people, many of them young, some of them very young indeed, to abandon everything and march. Imagine that. No chainmail, no siege towers, no war horses, just faith, walking on blistered feet toward a sea that was supposed to part. That image, thousands of people, with nothing but faith and blistered feet, walking toward a sea they believed would split open, is not the fairy tale you were told. If you want to keep uncovering the real stories behind the sanitized legends, subscribe now. There is a whole history full of sieges, betrayals, and brutal truths that your classroom never touched. Drop the word pueri in the comments if that one Latin term just flipped the whole story upside down for you. You would have believed it too, wouldn't you? If every priest in your village told you that God would make a path through the waves, if every neighbor who left never came back with bad news, only silence, you might have packed your satchel as well. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. The children were not foolish. They were faithful, and that faith was about to be harvested like a field of wheat. Now, let me slow down for a second, because I need you to understand the machine before you see it crush someone. In medieval Europe, The crusade was the greatest engine of social mobility and economic chaos that existed. When a call went out, even an unofficial one, it rippled through every level of society. Lords saw it as a way to escape debt and gain glory. Merchants saw it as a golden road of profit, transporting pilgrims and selling supplies at inflated prices. The church saw it as a channel for the violent energy of a warrior class that would otherwise be hacking at each other's throats at home. And the poor, the vast, voiceless, plough-pushing poor, saw it as the only promise of salvation they would ever own. They could not afford indulgences. They could not buy relics, but they could walk. They could suffer. They could offer their bodies to God and hope that counted for something. That is the soil in which the Children's Crusade grew, not in a palace, not in a pope's council chamber, but in the desperate, beautiful arithmetic of people who had nothing to lose except their souls. The French movement found its spark in a shepherd boy from the village of Cloyes, a young man history remembers as Stephen. The chronicles say he carried letters he claimed were from Jesus himself. And he preached with a fire that made grown priests look like cold candles. Word spread through the countryside like flame through dry straw. And when Stephen raised his voice, thousands answered. Meanwhile, in the Rhineland, another leader emerged. Nicholas of Cologne, a boy whose name is still whispered with either reverence or horror, depending on which chronicle you trust. He promised his followers that the sea would open for them, that they would walk to Jerusalem on dry ground, that God's own hand would part the waves. Think about the sheer audacity of that promise. Then think about how many people believed it enough to leave their homes forever. That is the moment you need to hold in your mind. The fields emptying, the villages going quiet, the roads filling with the sound of thousands of feet. No siege engines, no knights, no money worth mentioning, just a river of pilgrims, young and old, moving east because they were told the sea would kneel for them. And somewhere, in the counting houses of the ports and the market towns along their route, clever men were already sharpening their quills. Because where thousands of pilgrims walk, there is always someone ready to sell them shoes, bread, passage, or betrayal. And the medieval world had merchants who were very, very good at all four. But before we get to the merchants, let me introduce you to the road itself, because the road is a character in this story, and she was never kind. The journey from the Rhineland to the Mediterranean was not a pleasant stroll through storybook hills. This was the same brutal landscape that broke trained knights in full armor. Now imagine it with children, with the poor, with people who had never walked more than a day's travel from their own village. The chroniclers hint at what happened, and you have to read between the Latin to see it. The swollen feet, the cracked lips, the dysentery that emptied bowels and lives in equal measure. They collapsed on the roadsides, lips black with thirst, by the riverbanks where the water was poison to their unhardened stomachs. The strong carried the weak for a while, and then the strong had to make a choice. And that choice, made again and again along the road to the sea, is the first horror the legend hides from you. That choice, and the silence around it, is exactly why we do this channel. Subscribe if you want to keep walking. No, keep limping through the real history they never taught you. Drop a word in the comments. What would you call that moment when a pilgrim left another behind? Survival, necessity, or something we don't have a word for? I want to see what you come up with. Because when you are marching with 1,000 people and the food runs out, the group does not stop. It leaves the stragglers. It buries the dead in shallow graves that the wolves will find by nightfall. And it keeps walking, because stopping means joining them. You see, there is a reason why the old chronicles sometimes call this a movement, rather than a crusade. It had no discipline, no supply train, no chain of command. It was a crowd, a living, breathing, starving organism. And crowds, especially desperate ones, Do not make gentle decisions. The children were real. The suffering was real. But the idea that this was a sweet parade of innocence marching to a miracle, that is the stain you have to scrub away before you can see what actually happened. And what actually happened is about to get much, much darker. Now let me pull back the curtain on the adults, because this is where the story turns from tragedy to something that smells like conspiracy. The Children's Crusade was not officially sanctioned. You already know that. The Pope had nothing to do with it. And that mattered more than you might think. Without papal approval, the pilgrims had no legal protection, no guarantee of food from the towns they passed, no right to be treated as crusaders. They were, in the eyes of the law, just a mob of wanderers. And in the eyes of the merchants, they were inventory. Consider the geography. The German movement, led by Nicholas, headed south through the Alps toward Italy, aiming for the ports of Genoa and Pisa. The French movement, led by Stephen, crossed toward Marseille. Both of these routes passed through a world of market towns, river tolls, and harbor fees. And every one of those towns saw the same thing. Thousands of hungry, desperate, trusting people carrying whatever small valuables their families had scraped together. The merchants did what merchants do. They sold bread at famine prices. They sold shoes that fell apart after a day. They sold passage on ships. And here is where the record starts to go dark, because the chronicles do not agree on exactly what happened next. And the gap between their accounts is where the horror hides. Some say the children were told the sea would part, and when it did not, the faith shattered into confusion. Some say ships were offered, and the payment was not coin, but people. The most damning accounts claim that at Marseille, merchants who seem to have had connections to the slave trade loaded the young pilgrims onto vessels and sailed not east but south, to the markets of North Africa, where they were sold. You will not find the full details in any single chronicle, and that is exactly what you need to understand. The events are disputed. The beginning is hard to trace. The ending is harder still, but the silence at the heart of the record is itself a kind of evidence. Because when 1,000 children vanish into a harbour, and no letter, no chronicle, no royal inquiry ever accounts for them, you have to ask, whose interests did that silence serve? The Pope did not call for it. Indeed, no one did. And no one, it seems, was held accountable for what happened to the thousands who marched. That is the pattern you need to see. It is not a mystery. It is a system. But hold on, let me slow down. Because before we paint every merchant as a slaver and every survivor as a slave, I need to be honest with you about the sources, the way a real investigator would be. The chronicles of the time are not recordings. They are arguments. The writers, monks, scribes, clerics, had their own agendas, their own theological axes to grind. When a chronicler described the horrible fates of the participants, he was not always reporting an eyewitness fact. Sometimes he was teaching a lesson. Sometimes he was warning his readers about the arrogance of the poor, the danger of unsanctioned faith. We have to treat those accounts cautiously. The sources themselves demand it. One chronicle will tell you that the sea swallowed the Crusaders whole, a divine judgment on their presumption. Another will say the ships were wrecked in a storm. Another will whisper that 2 merchants, their names are lost to us, were later hanged for selling the pilgrims into slavery, and that the truth only came out years after, when one of the survivors returned. Do you feel the shape of that? The legend is a palimpsest. You can see the earlier words beneath the later ones if you tilt the page. Beneath the miracle story, beneath the tragedy story, beneath the moral lesson, there is a mundane and terrible reality. People, mostly young, mostly poor, were moved across the Mediterranean like cargo, and most of them never came home. None of the participants reached the Holy Land. That much is certain. The rest, the numbers, the fates, the exact chain of betrayal, dissolves into fog the closer you look. And that fog is not an accident. It is the natural product of a society that did not want to look too closely at what it had allowed to happen. You and I live in a world that insists on evidence, on documentation, on accountability. That world did not exist in the year 1212. When a peasant child disappeared, there was no missing persons report. When a ship sailed out of Marseille with a cargo of pilgrims, there was no manifest that anyone was required to keep. History, for most people, was something that happened to other people in other places. And the ones who wrote it down, the clerics, the chroniclers, the men of the church and the courts, they were the ones who decided what would be remembered. That palimpsest, the layers of legend covering up real children, is exactly what the chroniclers handed down, and the textbooks still treat it as gospel. Subscribe because we're about to peel back another layer, and I don't want you to miss the thread of light buried in all that darkness. In the comments, type the word palimpsest if you're ready to see what's beneath the story you were taught. You want to know why the textbooks give you the cherub version? Because the people who wrote the textbooks inherited their sources from the people who wrote the chronicles. And the chronicles, for all their Latin eloquence, were written by men who never once asked a single child what actually happened on that road. That is the first wound of this story, and it is a wound we can still feel today. The chronicles do preserve one thread of light in all this darkness, if you know where to look. Years after the ships vanished, the accounts say a survivor returned to Europe and told his story. He described the markets of North Africa, the auction blocks, the buyers who inspected teeth and muscle like livestock. And he told of some who resisted, who refused to accept what had happened to them. Those few, the story goes, did not break. They learned the language, they learned the customs, and some of them improbably rose, becoming servants in great houses, even officials in the very cities where they had been sold. History does not tell us their names, but their existence in the record is a quiet act of defiance against the silence that tried to swallow them whole. Think about what that means. The system that consumed them was vast, wealthy, and utterly indifferent. It had the church, the courts, the counting houses, the fleets. It had everything. And against all of that, the only weapon a child had was the refusal to disappear. You and I, we live on the other side of that silence. When we lose someone, we grieve publicly. We light candles. We post their faces where the whole world can see. Those children got nothing. No memorial, no roll of names, just a legend of sweetness and light that conveniently erased the blood, the hunger, and the profit. So when someone tells you the Children's Crusade was a sad little story about innocent faith, you now know better. It was a machinery of hope and exploitation, built by people who understood exactly what they were doing. And the truly chilling part is that the machinery didn't rust away in the 13th century. It just got newer. The ships got bigger. The markets got legal. The chronicles got replaced by ledgers, then by newsprint, then by algorithms. But the fundamental transaction never changed. Someone's desperate faith harvested for someone else's profit, wrapped in a story that makes everyone feel better about it. You are not the same person who started this story. You have seen the cracks in the stained glass, the gaps between the verses of the hymns, the silence where the voices of thousands should be. That is not a comfortable place to stand, but it is the only honest one. So hold on to that discomfort. Let it make you suspicious of pretty stories, of easy tragedies, of any tale that asks you to feel sorry without asking you to understand. Because the world still runs on faith, and it still pays very well to harvest it. The sea never parted. That is the cold, plain truth of it. And the children who waited on that shore, watching the waves refuse to kneel, they learned what generations before and after them have learned, and what you learned here today. Miracles do not move cargo. Men do, and they always collect.